everyone. Welcome back. This week we're moving on. We're going to finish up with the administration of police. So we're going to talk about police issues and practices. So we started chapter 4, talking about police organization and structure. Chapter 5, we talked about police personnel. So chapter 6, we're going to look at the specific issues that law enforcement have to deal with. So that's what we're going to move into today. Okay, so I'm going to share my PowerPoint with you. Okay, so this was just a quote that I've seen before, and I think it's interesting. It says, to be a police officer, one needs a size 3 hat, but a size 43 jacket. So I always ask, like, what do you think that means? What is it saying? It's a very insulting, I think, thing to police officers. It's saying you have a very little head, but you're big and strong. And so that's the question. Is that really true? When we know the complexities of law enforcement and how it works, can you really have, I think they're implying small brain, which I don't think is true, because it involves a lot of different issues when you're talking about police and the different problems that they have to solve. So one of the things I want you to do is I have posted a movie called Who Moved the Cheese? So I really would like you to watch this, and then that is going to be your discussion for chapter 6. It's really important to remember, because policing is so complicated and there's so many different issues and problems that have to be resolved, that you have to be flexible in your problem solving. You have to be willing to try new things and figure out if it's working and do self-assessment and be willing to change. And so this is a really old movie, but it's very famous in business and management schools because it shows the importance of flexibility and problem solving and trying new things. So you may want to stop the PowerPoint now and watch it, or you could just listen to the lecture video first and then watch it. Probably wouldn't matter. But that is going to be what your discussion is going to be about this week. So we are going to talk about the idea that when you are in the administration of policing, you have to do a lot of what we call problem solving, right? Because you're coming up with policies and procedures on how to correct problems in the community. So you'll send police officers, the line officers, out to handle different situations, and they clearly have to problem solve those individual situations. But as the administrator, you have to solve the problems of the whole organization. So a lot of the big issues of policing have to be analyzed and resolved by the administrators of that police department. So just to get you thinking, what are some of the biggest issues that police are dealing with today? So if you're asking yourself, well, what are some of these issues? That is what we're going to talk about. What are some of those issues that they face, and what should they do to solve these problems? So that's what we're going to look at today. Now, we talked about this in intro. Hopefully you remember we've used it for different things. But when you're talking about law enforcement, a lot of times you're talking about problem solving, because if we give officers discretion, then they have to act, then that means they're going to solve problems. And we said a lot of law enforcement is moving towards this community model. Well, part of the community policing service model is the idea of problem solving. So just as a review, remember, problem solving is scanning the situation, analyzing the different options, choosing a response, and then assessing how well that response worked. Okay, so we're going to use this model today to address a couple big law enforcement issues. So we're going to go through the analysis of a couple issues, and then your homework for this week will be you performing the SARA analysis on other issues that are discussed in the book, and you'll see that when we get to that. So we're just going to use one of the issues today to kind of work through some of the big problems that exist within law enforcement. And right now, one of the big issues they're trying to solve is terrorism. So that it would be a significant issue that law enforcement is trying to solve, right, with problem solving. So the first thing you do is scan. So remember, with scanning, you're trying to figure out as much as you can. So we said when you respond to a scene, you're scanning, you're trying to look around, you're trying to gather as much information that you possibly can gather. So we're not responding, but we still now as administrators have to solve these problems. So in order to solve the problem, we need to know as much as we can about the issue. So the first thing we do is we gather as much information as we can. So in this situation, we're going to talk about definitions. What is terrorism? So terrorism is the unlawful use of force against persons, properties to intimidate, coerce the government or its population to further political or social objectives. Okay, so we're scanning, we're gathering information. It's almost like you're researching your projects. You're gathering and getting as much information as you can about your topic. So that's what we started with. Now we're getting a little more information. We know that there are two different types of terrorism. We have international terrorism and we have domestic terrorism. And then we know international terrorism can be foreign sponsors of international terrorism. So it could be other countries that are sponsoring groups to commit terrorist acts in other countries. It could be formal terrorist groups that aren't government regulated. They're their own groups that are terrorists. Or it could be a loosely affiliated international radical extremists, so different pockets of extremists around the world. And then we also know that we have forms of domestic terrorism. Now, we also know that you can have other forms of terrorism. You can have bioterrorism. So this is using biological weapons to threaten or terrorize or scare communities. So exposing people to biological weapons, sarin gas, biological things. So anthrax. So that could be a form of terrorism. And then we also know that another big area of terrorism is cyber terrorism. So they're using the digital technology to attack other organizations, right? So cyber terrorism could be a form of terrorism. So we have scanned, we've gathered all our information. We've got as much information about the topic as we can. So now the next thing is analysis. We're going to look at all of that information and we're going to decide what policies can we think of that would help solve this problem. So once we research it and we have as much information as we can about the topic, then we want to come up with the policies we think would be best for handling this topic. What would be the best way to solve this topic? So that's analyzed, thinking about it, coming up with different policies and procedures that would be beneficial. So in the book, they talk about different ways to address terrorism. So these would be our different possible solutions, right? So posse comitatus, having the military operate in our country. We could have national incident management system, so a national approach to it, the USA Patriot Act, Military Commissions Act, fusion centers, drones. So what you would do is you would read about each of these in your book and you would look at each of the different policies that exist. And you would weigh each of these, right? So you would consider the pros and cons. We already talked about this as your force field analysis. So you look at each, you figure out each are possible solutions, and then you weigh the pros and cons of each one. So if you're doing your research paper, that's kind of what you're doing in your research paper. So you did phase 3, where you researched all of your information, you're coming up with your hypothesis, and then you're going to test different questions. And then at the end, you're going to come up with what policies you think would be best to solve your issue. Okay, so that's ultimately what you're going to do in your project. And so you have done a lot of the research, you know a lot of the proposed policies on your topic. You are comparing and contrasting the pros and cons of each of those, and then to ultimately pick a solution. So to go back to terrorism, you would read through each of these, analyze them, evaluate the pros and cons of each of these solutions, and then you would figure out which one you think was best. So let's say one of the things you do is you want to consider the consequences of your choices. So part of your force field analysis is to weigh the pros and cons of what can happen when you're trying to increase security and stop terrorism, but you also have to protect people's constitutional rights. So just to get you thinking about both sides, I have a little video. This one I'm going to show you. It's not too long. So I'll show you the video, and then you can get an idea of the different sides to the issue. Sorry. Let me try this again.
We all want to be safe. We also want to be free. And now, in response to terrorism, most every presidential candidate promises that he or she will protect us from ISIS. They'll say they'll do more than Obama did.
We won't weaken them. We won't degrade them. We will utterly destroy them. We will carpet bomb them into oblivion.
The United States should not delay in leading a global coalition to take out ISIS.
Yes, take ISIS out. But how? To utterly destroy ISIS, as Ted Cruz just said he'd do, we'd have to find and kill every terrorist in dozens of countries. How is this possible? And might our attacks create more terrorists, new terrorists? We'll debate that tonight. But we start by debating what America can do to find terrorists here at home. The NSA had been searching for them by collecting our phone records. Senator Rand Paul helped stop the bulk data collection by filibustering it.
I don't have a problem with going after terrorists and getting their records, but you should call a judge.
He held the floor for 10 hours, won some public support, and the NSA did eventually end its mass collection programs. But now, after San Bernardino and the attacks in Paris, Senator Marco Rubio accuses Senator Paul of gutting American intelligence.
We would want access to these people's phone records because it would give us clues as to who they were working with, who probably may be involved in plots themselves later on down the road. Rand Paul wants to get rid of that program.
Senator Paul joins us now. He says those phone records would give clues as to who terrorists work with, people who may be involved in plots now.
Well, you know, if Senator Rubio were present a little more doing his job in the Senate, he would realize that this bulk collection of data, this warrantless collection of data, is still ongoing and has been ongoing through the Paris tragedy, through the San Bernardino tragedy, and also through the Boston bombing. Not one terrorist act was thwarted. Not one terrorist was caught through this program. And really, I think what we've done is traded our liberty for a false sense of security. And I really don't think Marco Rubio has it correct. I think he's just a little too eager to give up our liberty, and I don't think it's made us safer at all.
Later in the program, a guest will say it takes 24 government employees to watch one terrorist subject 24/7. From that point of view, if you're looking for guys who might kill us, it makes more sense and seems less invasive to look for internet patterns of phone calls.
Apparently it doesn't work, though, and apparently we've been doing it for a decade and we still have attacks. And if you want to see what would happen if we gave even more freedom to the intelligence agencies, look at France. They have our bulk collection, our warrantless program, they have it on steroids. They look at everything, and yet the Paris tragedy unfolded without knowledge of this. Most of the times we've been able to thwart terrorism or stop them in the act, it's been from human intelligence.
Okay, accepting that human intelligence is best and data collection may not have worked so far. But can you explain to people what the problem is, who say, so what, this stuff is flying through the air anyway. I don't care about if they know who I've talked to, the phone company knows anyway.
The best way to think about metadata is 2 Stanford students had people put an app voluntarily on their phone to just record their metadata, how long their phone calls were and who they called. But you know what they determined is about 85% of the time they could tell your religion. Nearly 100% of the time they could tell who your doctor was. Most time they could, by intuition or deduction, determine what kind of medicines you were taking, what kind of diseases you had. That's pretty personal information. I don't think everybody should see that. Also your credit card information, that's metadata. Is it personal whether or not I gamble, whether I smoke or whether I drink, whether or not, what kind of magazines, if I read Reason magazine, am I somehow, to be followed because I believe in liberty and the free market?
So far you haven't moved your fellow Republican presidential candidates. Here's Governor Chris Christie saying next time there's an attack, Rand Paul should be on the stand.
He should be in front of hearings in front of Congress if there's another attack, not the director of the FBI or the director of the CIA.
You should be on the stand.
You know, that's pretty juvenile. There's also people who, politicians for their own sort of self-gain, will want to beat their chest and appear as if they're the most patriotic. But I don't think it's patriotic to give up your rights. I think it's patriotic in difficult times to say, you know what, I will defend the Constitution, I will defend the Bill of Rights, and just because I am fearful or I don't want to be one of those who's going to spread and sell fear in order to ultimately live in a police state, I just think that's wrong.
Well, let's talk about the refugees briefly. That they inspire fear in some. Donald Trump has now said, don't take anyone who's a Muslim. You have said we should stop letting people in from 34 countries.
At least temporarily. If we can't get a handle on who's here and what their intentions are, I think maybe you have to slow it down a little bit.
So you might stop it for how long? A month? 4 months? How is what you're saying different from what Trump says?
Ours wouldn't be a religious test. Ours is based on areas of terrorism and areas of people who've expressed a hatred for the United States. North Korea is also on the list. So ours isn't directed towards religion. It's directed towards a risk or a threat of terrorism being imported into our country. But having rules about who comes and who enters and how easy or how hard it is to come, I think is pretty reasonable. And I think most Americans do want that.
So when you are watching that, you can see that there are different solutions that are being proposed to the stopping of terrorism, right? So one is collecting a metadata, and that they could track this information and find this information. And that could be a way that could be used.
Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to today's event. My name is Doug Rogers. I teach in the anthropology department.
Somehow another video started. Hold on a second. I'm sorry.
European and Eurasian studies.
Oh, where is it?
Special event, not just because of our guest, who's one of the most.
Sorry about that. I thought I closed it out. Okay, so one of the things that you can see is they talked about are different possible solutions, right? So one of the things they talked about as a solution was the collection of metadata. So we could use this data, they could collect it on mass amounts, they can use that information to try to stop terrorism. So that was one of the possible solutions. And then they went through the pros and cons of that possible solution. It could interfere with people's liberties. They could be stopping terrorism, but it could interfere with people's constitutional liberties. So that was the pros and cons. The second one they talked about is starting to limit who can come into the country. So that might be a way to stop terrorism, is regulating immigration. If we find that that was a cause of terrorism, then that would be a possible solution. But then you have to do the pros and cons of that. So you can see that when you can come up with different policies and procedures on how to stop one of these problems, you have to do that weighing, that back and forth. What are the pros of that? What are the cons of that? And that's a really important part of problem solving, keeping your eyes open and seeing that there are different ways to view things. They're not always just going to be your way and no other way. You always want to keep your mind open to the idea that there are pros and cons to each side. So once you look at all your solutions and you look at the pros and cons to the different sides, then the next thing you do is you pick which one you think is the best solution. That's your response. So you look at all the possible solutions, and then you decide which one do you think works the best. Okay, so if you were in the FBI and this was your job to try to lower terrorism, which one of those 4 things would you choose? Which one do you think would be the best option? That would be your response. And then the last step would be, how do you assess that? If after you pick a policy and you take a step back, how do we measure to see if our policy was successful? So we're not going to actually do the assessment, but we need to figure out how we would assess. So if you are trying to review whether what you did worked, you have to think of what measurements would you use. So maybe for something like terrorism, your measurement of success is you don't have terrorist attacks for quite a while, okay? And then maybe you can reflect back and say, yes, this was a good tool to use to stop terrorism. So you just have to take that step back and really look at it and assess what you chose and did it work. If it didn't work, then we go back to the analysis phase, and then we pick another policy or procedure and we try something else, and then we assess it again. Okay, so that is the problem solving method, and that's what police do when they want to solve these problems. So just to go through another one fairly quickly, just to show you again the analysis. A big issue right now that police are dealing with is excessive use of force by officers. So it's on the news all the time. There's media accounts. There's all kinds of stuff out there about it. So it is something that administrators of police departments have to constantly think about. How can we assure that our officers do not use excessive force our department will be sued. It looks bad. People don't trust our department. So what are policies and procedures that we can put in place to try to lower the risk that our department would ever be involved in excessive use of force case? So we start with SCAN. We come up with the basic information. So we have to define use of force, the amount of effort necessary to compel compliance with an unwilling suspect. That's what's use of force. How much force do you have to use to get them to do what you want? You want to know, when you're talking about law enforcement, what are the rules that they have to follow? So police and military are allowed to use force against citizens without it being a crime. So you want to analyze and gather all that information. You want to know the laws that are regulating that issue. So one of the laws is Graham versus Connor, and it sets out the standard of when law enforcement can use force. And it says police can use force, but it must be objectively reasonable in view of the facts and circumstances of each case. So that's the standard. You have to have a use of force that's reasonable in the circumstances. So if you look at all the facts and circumstances surrounding an incident, was it objectively reasonable for a law enforcement officer in that situation to use the force that was used? So we know what it is, we define it, we find out what court cases or laws deal with it. We have as much information as we can about it. Once we have that, then here's a little more types of abuse. It could be physical abuse, like excessive force. It could be verbal or psychological force or abuse. There we have a lot of discussion in the criminal justice field about how police officers treat citizens and speak to citizens. It also could be verbal or psychological abuse when you're talking about interrogations and interrogation methods. It could be legal abuse. You could be planting evidence. You could be filing false claims against people. You could be wrongfully arresting people. So there's different ways that force can be abused. So those are the different types of force. And then a couple more facts. Arrests is the strongest predictor of use of force. So we know that an officer that makes a significant amount of arrests is more likely to engage in excessive use of force. Few officers account for most of the violent incidents. So we know this isn't a huge issue for all police officers. It's a relatively small amount of police officers. Unfortunately, gets lots and lots of media attention, but we know that it is a relatively small amount of officers that engage in this conduct. We know male officers are much more likely to use excessive force than female officers. And then we know a lot of times the victims of this kind of force are suffering from some form of mental illness. So we know that another issue to deal with is having our officers have the knowledge and tools to handle mentally ill without reverting to excessive use of force. So we have all of that information. Now that we have that information, we would come up with different policies and procedures that could be used to help stop the excessive use of force. Okay, so we gathered all the research, we have all of the knowledge that we have about it. Now we're going to look through that and come up with what are some of the policies and procedures that could be used to try to reduce any possibility of officers using excessive use of force. So what are some of these policies? One of them is adopt an early warning system. So if you have officers that are engaging in certain behaviors that tend to lead to excessive use of force allegations, maybe you have an early warning system where you address it immediately with those officers. Maybe you develop a stronger mentoring program with other officers. Maybe you hire more women, because we just said women are less likely to use excessive force. Maybe we increase training and the amount of training that an officer will use. Maybe we rethink the way that we're training, okay? So maybe we increase training, maybe we change the training model. Maybe we're training them in a wrong way. Maybe we increase training in communication and de-escalation. So maybe that's where we need to turn to more communications. So those would all be possible policies. So we analyze and we brainstorm what are all of the possibilities that we could use, what are different policies. Now remember, we have our response. What policy would you use to help with excessive use of force? So now you have all of these policies. which one would you choose as the best response? So you would choose one of those and you would implement it. After you implement it, then you have to say, okay, how are we going to measure our success? What is our assessment tool? What are we going to do to see if what our choice is, if it was a good choice? So how are we going to measure this? Maybe it's just decreased use of excessive force by officers, right? Maybe it's decreased complaints by citizens. Maybe it's increased hours of training. Maybe it's surveys of police officers to see if they feel better trained. So you would then assess, how are we going to assess success? How are we going to figure out if it is successful? Okay, so that is me kind of explaining the process that you would go through if you had to solve one of these problems. So that is going to be your homework for chapter 6. There are several issues. I gave you a list of different issues that are discussed in the book. So what I want you to do is I want you to read through some of the material on each of pick one issue. You only have to do one, only pick one issue. Every once in a while, people want to do them all. That's way, way too much. Just pick one issue. Read the information about your issue. So you're scanning, you're getting as much information as you can about it. Then think about the possible solutions to your issue. Tell me which policies you think would be the best solution. Pick one. And then how would you assess whether your policy was successful? So just what we did in class is what you'll do for your homework. So that's all I have for today. Oh, and these are some of the issues you can choose from. Don't forget, only choose one. Okay, so that's all I have for today. If you have any questions on that, please reach out. I'll be more than happy to talk to you about it and work with you. Otherwise, keep moving forward. The same thing we're doing with this problem solving is really similar to what you're going to be doing on your research projects. You already did like the scanning and the gathering all your information. And then after that, you'll start thinking about what are some policies or procedures you could implement. And then you'll choose which one you think is best. And then you'll talk about how it would be assessed. So that's it. I hope you have a great week. There's only one lecture this week. This is the only lecture. And then you can just work more on your project this week. So just make sure you do the discussion, that you do the assignment, and then work on your project. So have a great week, and I'll see you soon.